My daughter told me not to come for Christmas. Her new husband will be there, she said. We are trying to make him feel like family. So I spent Christmas Eve my own way. But just after midnight, my daughter called. Her voice was shaking. Dad, why are you on the news? The ice in my glass of bourbon clinked softly as I sat alone in the dark. It was exactly 12:15 in the morning on Christmas Day. Outside the heavy frost-covered windows of my Chicago home, the snow was falling in thick, quiet blankets. The world was peaceful. But inside my living room, the silence was about to be shattered. My phone began to vibrate on the mahogany coffee table. It buzzed relentlessly, lighting up the dim room with a harsh, frantic glow. The caller ID flashed a name I had expected to see, but not under these circumstances. It was Valerie, my only daughter. I let it ring 3 times. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the amber liquid, feeling the familiar warmth travel down my chest. I knew why she was calling. She was not calling to wish me a Merry Christmas. She was not calling to apologize for banning her 76-year-old father from the holiday dinner. She was calling because the walls of her perfect, greedy little world were collapsing right in front of her eyes. I picked up the phone and pressed it to my ear. I did not even get a chance to say hello. Dad. What did you just do? Valerie screamed. Her voice was pure, unfiltered panic. It was a pitch I had not heard from her since she was a little girl. Dad, answer me right now. You are on national television. The contract. You said you signed the contract. What is going on? I did not answer her immediately. Instead, I reached for the television remote, resting on the arm of my leather recliner. I pressed the mute button, bringing the sound of the late-night news broadcast into the quiet room. On the large flat screen, a live press conference was playing. The banner at the bottom of the screen read, "Breaking News." 76-year-old retired structural engineer donates $120 million commercial plot to federal veterans housing. There I was on the screen, standing tall and unbothered, wearing my best charcoal gray suit right next to the governor of Illinois. The camera flashed as I shook hands with the director of the Department of Veterans Affairs. It was a beautiful ceremony, the kind of legacy-defining moment that most men only dream of. But to Valerie, it was a nightmare broadcasted in high definition. Dad, please tell me this is a prank, she hyperventilated through the phone speaker. Tell me you did not just give away the South Side land. Derek and Martin are going crazy. The buyers are here. They are in my living room, Dad. We were supposed to close the deal at midnight. You signed the power of attorney. You gave us the rights. Why are you on television giving it away to the government? I listened to her desperate breaths. I pictured the scene in her lavish mansion. The expensive champagne poured and waiting to be toasted. The cartel-backed lawyers sitting on her velvet sofas, realizing that the $5 million bribe they paid. Her husband was now completely worthless. I pictured the absolute dread washing over the people who thought they could drug me, steal my life work, and leave me to rot. I took another slow sip of bourbon. The taste was exceptionally perfectly sweet tonight. Merry Christmas, Valerie, I said, my voice steady, cold, and devoid of any paternal warmth she might have been hoping to manipulate. Tell the men standing in your living room that they are entirely out of luck. That land now belongs to the United States government. And unlike your father, the federal government does not take kindly to trespassers. Dad, wait, please, you do not understand what you have just done. They are going to... I ended the call. I placed the phone face down on the table and let out a long, quiet exhale. It was done. The trap had snapped shut, breaking the bones of the predators who thought I was easy prey. But to understand how a father is pushed to the unimaginable point of financially executing his own daughter on national television, we have to rewind the clock. We have to go back exactly 3 weeks to the moment this entire twisted deception began. 3 weeks earlier. The first week of December was unusually bitter in Chicago. The wind coming off Lake Michigan cut right through your coat. I had spent the morning organizing my study, looking through old blueprints from my days as a structural engineer. My mind was sharp. At 76, I still did the crossword puzzle every morning in pen, and I managed my own investment portfolio. I was retired, yes, but I was far from finished. That afternoon, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. It was Derek, my daughter's husband. Derek was a high-ranking city zoning commissioner. He was a man who wore suits that cost more than my first car, and smiled with his teeth, never with his eyes. I had never fully trusted him, but Valerie loved him, and a father makes peace with his daughter's choices. Richard, Derek said smoothly as I opened the door. He barged in, rubbing his hands together to shake off the cold. He was carrying a thick, leather-bound legal portfolio under his arm. I hope I am not interrupting anything important. I just need a few minutes of your time. I offered him coffee, which he quickly declined. He seemed anxious. His foot tapped a rapid rhythm against my hardwood floor as he sat down at the dining table. He unzipped the portfolio and slid a stack of dense legal documents toward me. "What is this, Derek?" I asked, putting on my reading glasses. "It is the tax-exempt college trust for the twins," he explained, referring to my grandsons. "Valerie and I have been working with our financial planners. Because of the end-of-year tax deadlines, we need to establish the trust before January 1st to maximize the federal exemptions. We just need your signature as the primary grantor to lock in the initial seed funds. It is all standard boilerplate language. A college trust. It sounded so responsible, so perfectly normal for a family preparing for the future. But as I reached for the pen he eagerly offered, my cell phone began to ring from the kitchen counter. "Excuse me a moment," I said. His jaw tightened in annoyance, but he forced a polite nod. I walked into the kitchen and answered. It was Valerie. Her voice lacked the usual cheerful greeting. "Hi, Dad," she said very quickly. "Listen, about the Christmas Eve dinner next week. I do not think you should come this year." This was no request. It was an eviction notice from my own family life. I stood completely still, the cold edge of the kitchen counter pressed against my hip as my daughter's words echoed. Valerie sighed through the receiver. It was that dramatic sigh she perfected over the years, deployed when masquerading selfishness as a burden. I stared at the frost on my window, the harsh Chicago winter, matching the sudden freeze taking over my chest. "Mom is coming with Martin," Valerie whispered. "You know how Martin gets during the holidays, Dad. He struggles with his mental health. He feels inadequate, like he does not belong. Derek and I really need to make him feel like the patriarch this year. We need to center the holiday around him, to lift his spirits and make him feel welcomed. You understand, right? It would just be too awkward and tense if you were there. We need a peaceful Christmas." I listened to the steady hum of the refrigerator. The sheer audacity hung in the air between us. I spent 40 grueling years building a secure life for my family. I paid for Valerie's exclusive private schools, financed her lavish destination wedding to Derek, and provided the massive down payment on the very mansion I was now legally forbidden to enter. And now I was unceremoniously cast aside so my former wife, new husband, could play the role of the esteemed family patriarch. I felt the bitter insult burning the back of my throat. But I did not argue. I did not yell, and I certainly did not beg for an invitation to my own family's table. A lifetime of managing volatile construction sites and negotiating with hostile city contractors taught me one absolute rule of survival. When someone shows you their true nature, you do not try to correct them. You simply observe their actions. "Of course, Valerie," I replied, injecting the perfect amount of quiet resignation into my voice to play the part she expected. "I understand completely. I just want you all to have a peaceful holiday together. Tell the boys their grandfather loves them very much." I hung up the phone before she could offer hollow apologies. I stood alone in the kitchen, letting the stark reality of my daughter's betrayal wash over me. She had orchestrated this perfectly. Banned the old man from the house under the righteous guise of empathy for a fragile stepfather, all while her husband sat comfortably in my dining room, aggressively pressing me to sign legal documents. I took a deep breath, rolled my shoulders back to release the tension, and purposefully let them slump forward. I walked out of the kitchen with the slow, shuffling gait of a defeated 76-year-old man who had accepted his fading relevance. Derek was waiting at the dining table. He had not touched the hot coffee I offered him earlier. Instead, he was obsessively tapping his expensive gold watch, his eyes darting impatiently between his glowing phone screen and the thick stack of premium papers laid out perfectly in front of him. "Everything all right with Val?" Derek asked, his tone dripping with artificial concern. He did not actually care about the phone call or my emotional well-being. He only cared about securing my signature and getting out of my house quickly. I offered him a weak, trembling smile, pulling out a heavy wooden chair and sitting down slowly, ensuring my joints popped loudly for effect. "Yes, we were just finalizing some holiday plans," I said quietly, waving my wrinkled hand through the air, as if swatting away a trivial matter. "Now tell me more about this trust for the boys. You said the matter was extremely urgent." Derek immediately leaned forward, resting his tailored elbows on my polished dining table. His eyes locked onto mine with the predatory, unwavering focus of a hungry salesman closing a massive commission. "Exactly, Richard," he said, his voice dropping into a smooth, highly persuasive rhythm. "As you undoubtedly know, federal tax laws are changing drastically next year. Valerie and I want to set up an ironclad tax-exempt college trust for Liam and Noah. We desperately want their educational futures guaranteed, regardless of what happens in the economy." He pointed to the thick stack of legal documents resting between us. The papers were pristine, secured in a premium leather binding that smelled of expensive law offices. "We are doing all the heavy financial lifting," he continued, tapping the top page gently with his index finger. "But our financial planners strongly advised us that the trust would yield the maximum possible federal tax exemptions if it was officially seeded and initiated by a direct grandparent. Because of strict end-of-year tax deadlines, the state requires all originating signatures to be fully filed and notarized by the end of this week. If we do not lock this legal framework in right now today, the boys will lose out on decades of compounded tax-free monetary growth." He slid the heavy leather portfolio closer to me across the table smoothly, handing me a sleek silver fountain pen from his breast pocket. I looked down at the expensive pen, then back up at Derek. He was exceptionally good at this. I was actively using my twin grandsons as emotional leverage, expertly wrapping a complex legal demand in the warm blanket of a grandfather's unconditional love. Any other retired man eager to secure his family's future and perhaps intimidated by dense legal jargon would have signed those papers immediately, without a second thought. They would have implicitly trusted their successful, well-educated city commissioner son-in-law to do the right thing. I reached out with a deliberately trembling hand and took the heavy silver pen. Derek's stiff shoulders noticeably dropped with immediate relief. He leaned back in his chair, a faint, victorious smirk playing at the very corners of his mouth. "Just sign your name right at the bottom of the yellow sticky tabs, Richard," he instructed, gently pointing to the designated signature lines. "I will personally take care of all the municipal filing protocols and the notary fees this afternoon. You will not have to worry about a single thing." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes cast downward in submission. I adjusted my reading glasses, letting them slip slightly down the bridge of my nose to complete the picture of a tired, highly compliant elder. I flipped open the thick leather cover and carefully examined page 4. The breath caught in my throat. Hidden halfway down the typed page was a topographic parcel identification number. It was the municipal zoning code for 50 acres of barren wasteland I purchased back in 1986. Derek was not setting up a college trust. He was stealing my land. I did not gasp. I did not blink. I kept my breathing slow and measured, forcing my heart to maintain a steady rhythm, despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. Derek sat directly across from me, sipping his coffee, his eyes glued to his phone. He had absolutely no idea that I had just spotted the topographic parcel identification number buried in the dense legal text. 50 acres of Southside industrial land. I bought that dirt back in 1986 for pennies. It had sat vacant for decades, an abandoned relic of old municipal plans that never materialized. Why on earth was my son-in-law trying to sneak a transfer of that specific property into a supposed college trust for my grandsons? The answer was obvious. He was not protecting my family. He was executing a calculated heist right inside my own dining room. I knew better than to confront him. Confrontation is the weapon of the unprepared. If I challenged him right now, he would simply snatch the documents back, invent a smooth legal excuse, and find a more aggressive way to strip me of my assets. I needed him to leave this house believing he had won. I needed him completely oblivious, drunk on his own perceived victory, so I could dismantle his entire life from the shadows. But I also could not legally sign away my property. I needed a distraction. I raised my hands to rub my tired eyes, letting out a heavy, exhausted sigh. As I brought my hands down my elbow, purposefully clipped the edge of my reading glasses resting on the table. They clattered onto the hardwood floor, sliding just beneath Derek's chair. "Oh, clumsy me!" I muttered, my voice perfectly pitched to sound frail and apologetic. My hands are just not what they used to be these days. Do you mind grabbing those for me, Derek? My back is terribly stiff this afternoon. Derek let out an irritated breath, though he tried to mask it with a tight smile. "Of course, Richard," he said. He pushed his chair back and leaned down under the table to retrieve the glasses. That was all the time I needed. I reached into the breast pocket of my cardigan. I always carried 2 pens. One was a standard black ballpoint. The other was a specialized drafting pen from my days as a structural engineer. It contained a very specific auto-fading friction ink. We used it decades ago for temporary structural overlays on master blueprints. When exposed to ambient room temperature and standard light, the chemical composition of the ink completely evaporates. In exactly 48 hours, any signature written with that pen would vanish without a single trace, leaving behind nothing but a blank, pristine white page. I smoothly swapped the heavy silver pen Derek had given me for my own drafting pen. By the time Derek sat back up and placed my glasses on the table, I was already holding the new pen over the signature line. "Thank you, son," I said, maintaining the fragile persona. "Let us get this done for the boys." I pressed the pen to the paper. I made sure to let my hand tremble slightly as I wrote my name, pressing hard enough to make the signature look authentic, but careful not to score the paper too deeply. I signed all 4 designated pages. Every stroke of the fading ink was a silent declaration of war. I slid the thick leather portfolio back across the table. Derek practically snatched it from my hands. The relief radiating from his body was palpable. He quickly flipped through the pages to verify my signatures, his eyes gleaming with unrestrained greed. "Excellent," Richard Derek said swiftly, zipping the leather portfolio shut and tucking it securely under his arm. He stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "This is going to secure a beautiful future for Liam and Noah. You did a really good thing today. I will take this straight to the municipal records office to get it officially filed before the holiday closures kick in." I remained seated, looking up at him with tired, compliant eyes. "Do not forget to tell Valerie that I completely understand about Christmas Eve," I said softly. "I just want Martin to feel comfortable. Have a wonderful dinner, Derek." Derek was already halfway to the front door. He did not even bother to turn around to wish me a Merry Christmas in return. "I will let her know," he called back over his shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Richard. Get some rest." The heavy wooden front door clicked shut. The deadbolt engaged. I sat in the absolute silence of my dining room for exactly 2 minutes, listening to the sound of his luxury sedan engine roaring to life and speeding away down my snow-covered driveway. As the sound faded into the distance, my frail posture vanished entirely. I sat up straight. The fog of the confused, compliant elderly father dissolved, replaced by the sharp, analytical mind of a man who had successfully managed multi-million-dollar construction projects for 40 years. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I did not call Valerie. I did not call my ex-wife. I dialed a number I had not called in nearly 3 years. The phone rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Warren here," the voice said. Warren was a retired corporate litigator. He was a cutthroat, deeply cynical man who understood the dark underbelly of municipal politics better than anyone in the entire city of Chicago. 30 years ago, I helped him navigate a brutally complex and hostile divorce, quietly securing his assets when his former business partners tried to completely ruin him. He owed me a massive blood debt, and he was the only person ruthless enough to help me legally execute the counterstrike. Strike I was currently planning in my mind. "Warren, it is Richard," I said, my voice completely steady and cold. "Richard," Warren replied, sounding genuinely surprised. "It has been a long time, my friend." "To what do?" "The rare pleasure of a phone call exactly 3 days before the Christmas holiday." I walked over to the frosty glass window and looked out at the empty, quiet street where my deceitful son-in-law had just made his desperate getaway. "I need you to pull up the city zoning records for my South Side industrial lot," I instructed, firmly, leaving no room for debate. "The 50-acre parcel right by the old train tracks." Warren paused for a second. His tone shifted instantly from friendly nostalgia to purely serious professional focus. "What is going on, Richard? Did someone finally make a blind offer on that useless piece of wasteland?" I watched the heavy snow continue to fall from the gray sky, slowly blanketing the frozen city in a cold, unforgiving white layer. "No," I replied smoothly. "My son-in-law just walked into my house and tried to steal it from me. I need to know exactly what that specific land is truly worth today, right this very minute." I drove through the heavy Chicago snow to a private office building downtown. Warren maintained a secure, windowless archive room in the basement of his old law firm. It was a fortress of mahogany and servers. Warren was waiting for me. I was a tall, imposing man with a sharp mind and absolutely no patience for small talk. He had already fired up his encrypted computers by the time I walked through the heavy steel door. I brushed the snow off my coat and sat across from him. I told him exactly what happened in my dining room. I explained the topographic parcel identification number I had seen on page 4. Warren did not say a single word. He simply adjusted his glasses and began typing rapidly on his keyboard. His fingers moved with the speed and precision of a man who had spent 40 years dismantling corporate empires. He bypassed the standard municipal firewalls and accessed the restricted zoning databases of the City Planning Commission. The glowing screen reflected in his dark eyes. "Richard, your son-in-law has been very busy." Warren said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. He turned the monitor toward me so I could see the official city ledgers. I leaned forward and carefully read the screen. The 50 acres of barren industrial wasteland I had purchased over 3 decades ago was no longer classified as a dead zone. According to the internal municipal registry, the entire sector had been secretly rezoned just last month. The new classification read Prime Tech Commercial. I stared at the glowing digital letters. Rezoning a sector like that takes years of public hearings, environmental impact studies, and city council votes. But this had been pushed through the shadows. I looked at the digital signature on the approval form. It was Derek. My own son-in-law had used his high-ranking position as a city zoning commissioner to bypass every single legal hurdle. He had quietly transformed my worthless dirt into the most valuable real estate in the entire metropolitan area. Why, I asked, feeling a cold knot tightening deep in my stomach. Why risk federal prison for a sudden rezoning scheme? Warren tapped another key, bringing up a confidential corporate proposal that had been filed under a dummy corporation. Because a massive Silicon Valley tech conglomerate is currently looking to build their new Midwest headquarters, Warren explained calmly. They need 50 acres of uninterrupted prime commercial land close to the city infrastructure. They have been quietly scouting locations for a year. Derek found out. He pushed the rezoning through his department to make your specific lot the only viable candidate in the state. I swallowed hard. How much are they offering for the land? Warren looked me dead in the eyes. $120 million, Richard. The number echoed in the quiet basement room. $120 million. My daughter and her husband were not just trying to steal a forgotten piece of property. They were orchestrating a 9-figure heist right under my nose. The sheer scale of the greed was suffocating. I had spent 40 years building bridges and skyscrapers, saving every penny to ensure my family would never have to struggle. I had given Valerie everything she ever asked for. And yet, the promise of a massive tech payout had turned her and her husband into absolute monsters. They were willing to wipe out my legacy for a corporate buyout, but there is a fatal flaw in their plan, I said slowly, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. The deed is still solely in my name. They cannot sell the land to a tech conglomerate unless I legally sign over the property rights. That is why Derek brought those papers to my house today. I wanted me to unknowingly transfer the title under the guise of a college trust for the twins. Warren shook his head, his expression growing significantly darker. He reached for a secondary tablet resting on his desk. While you were driving over here, I managed to pull the digital draft of the exact document Derek just filed with the county clerk. I wanted to see exactly what kind of trust he was trying to establish. He handed the tablet to me. I took it, my hands feeling unusually heavy. I expected to see a fraudulent property transfer agreement. I expected to see a shady corporate shell company listed as the beneficiary. But as my eyes scanned the legal text, my blood ran completely cold. It was not a land transfer document. It was not a financial trust. The title of the document read, "Full Medical Power of Attorney and Declaration of Incompetency." I stopped breathing. The words blurred together on the screen as the horrifying reality of their plan finally clicked into place. Derek and Valerie were not just trying to trick me into giving them the deed. They were legally declaring me mentally incompetent. The document stated that I was suffering from severe, rapidly advancing cognitive decline. It claimed I was a danger to myself and entirely incapable of managing my own physical, medical, and financial well-being. By signing those papers, I would have surrendered every single one of my basic human rights. I would have granted Derek and Valerie absolute legal control over my health care, my bank accounts, my property, and my personal freedom. They would have the authority to place me in a locked psychiatric facility against my will. They would have the power to liquidate my entire estate, sell the $120 million property to the tech conglomerate, and leave me rotting in a sterile room until the day I died. "This is a death sentence," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of profound sorrow and escalating rage. "My own daughter is trying to declare me insane." Warren leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together tightly. "They did not just want your money, Richard. They wanted to erase you completely. Once a judge stamps a medical power of attorney of this magnitude, you become a ghost in the eyes of the law. You cannot hire a lawyer. You cannot access your own money to fight back. You are completely trapped." I looked away from the screen, staring blankly at the concrete wall. Valerie had called me just hours ago, telling me not to come for Christmas dinner. She said Martin was depressed. She said she wanted a peaceful holiday without my presence. It was all a meticulously crafted psychological game. She wanted me isolated, lonely, and emotionally vulnerable. She wanted me sitting in my empty house doubting my own worth, while she and her husband finalized the legal paperwork to strip me of my sanity and my fortune. The betrayal was absolute. It went far beyond simple financial greed. It was a calculated, soulless attempt to destroy a father who had given them nothing but unconditional support. The little girl I had carried on my shoulders, the daughter whose scraped knees I had bandaged, was actively participating in my psychological and financial execution. I slowly closed my eyes in the dark room. I opened my eyes and looked at Warren. The anger I felt was cold and heavy. I thanked him for his rapid work and told him I needed to see the property with my own eyes. Warren warned me to be careful, advising me not to alert Derek to our discovery. I assured him I had spent my entire career managing hostile construction sites and knew how to handle myself. I left the windowless archive room and walked back out into the freezing Chicago afternoon. The snow was falling harder now, accumulating on the windshield of my car. I cleared the ice, got behind the wheel, and started the engine. The drive to the south side was a slow, treacherous crawl through heavy traffic and slick roads. My mind raced with the sheer audacity of my daughter and her husband. They were trying to erase my legal existence for a corporate payout. I needed to see exactly how far their arrogance had pushed them. I navigated the familiar industrial streets, the crumbling brick warehouses and rusted chain-link fences flying past my window. It took nearly an hour to reach the edge of my 50-acre parcel. When I finally turned onto the cracked asphalt road leading to my land, my chest tightened. The property was supposed to be completely abandoned. It was a massive expanse of frozen dirt, overgrown weeds, and broken concrete slabs. But it was not empty today. Through the thick curtain of falling snow, I could see the glaring yellow headlights of 3 heavy-duty utility trucks parked aggressively across the property line. Several large floodlights had been set up on portable aluminum tripods, illuminating a busy staging area. I parked my car a block away, keeping it hidden behind an old crumbling brick wall. I zipped my heavy winter coat up to my chin and stepped out into the biting wind. As I walked closer, the rhythmic, mechanical pounding of a hydraulic soil drill echoed through the freezing air. There were at least half a dozen men wearing bright orange high-visibility jackets and thick hard hats. They were actively surveying the terrain and extracting deep-core soil samples. This was not a preliminary municipal inspection. This was an advanced commercial geotechnical survey, the exact kind of expensive preparation required immediately before a massive corporate groundbreaking ceremony. Derek had not just initiated the rezoning paperwork. He had already granted the tech conglomerate full physical access to my private property. They were drilling into my land, measuring my dirt, and preparing to pour their foundations, all while assuming I was sitting cluelessly in my living room, preparing for the holidays. The utter disrespect fueled a burning fire in my stomach. I knew I needed to find out exactly who was running this unauthorized survey operation. I remembered my strategy. I dropped my shoulders, adopted a slow, unsteady shuffle, and walked deliberately toward the brightly lit staging area. I let my jaw hang slightly slack, widening my eyes to project the image of a bewildered, lost senior citizen who had simply wandered onto an active construction site. The snow crunched loudly beneath my boots as I crossed the property line. One of the men carrying a large clipboard turned around and spotted me. He immediately signaled to a heavily built man operating the main hydraulic drill. The noise of the machine cut off abruptly, leaving only the howling wind. The heavily built man wiped grease from his thick gloves and marched directly toward me. "Hey there, buddy," the man shouted, his voice rough and incredibly dismissive. "You cannot be out here. This is a restricted commercial zone. You need to turn around and head back to the main road before you get hurt." I stopped walking and looked around with exaggerated confusion, pointing a trembling finger toward the massive drilling rig. "I was just taking my afternoon walk," I said, making my voice sound thin and extremely fragile. "I have walked down this old road for years. What are you young men doing to all this dirt? Is the city finally building a new park?" The foreman let out a harsh, condescending laugh. He stepped closer, his massive frame towering over my hunched posture. He looked at me as if I were a stray dog that had wandered into a sterile hospital. "We are not building a public park, old man," he sneered, pointing a thick thumb back toward his crew. "We are conducting deep structural soil tests for a massive corporate campus." Now I am going to ask you nicely one last time to turn around and beat it. You are violating strict private property laws by standing here." I tilted my head, putting on a highly convincing performance of an elderly man struggling to process basic information. "Private property," I repeated slowly, letting my voice waver perfectly. "But this land has been completely empty for decades. I thought the city owned all this useless dirt. Nobody has ever claimed it." The foreman sighed heavily, clearly losing whatever tiny ounce of patience he possessed. He unclipped a heavy radio from his bright orange belt and glared down at me. "Look, I do not have the time or the crayons to explain commercial real estate development to you," he barked aggressively. "The city does not own this land anymore. It was just privately acquired for a massive commercial project. We have incredibly tight deadlines, and I cannot have a confused local wandering into my active heavy machinery." I took a small step backward, acting appropriately intimidated by his aggressive volume. "I am sorry to bother you, sir," I mumbled apologetically, wrapping my arms around my chest to feign severe vulnerability to the cold. "I just live a few streets over. I did not realize someone actually bought this place. Who owns all this dirt now?" The foreman rolled his eyes, visibly annoyed that he had to justify his presence to someone he considered entirely irrelevant. He looked down at his heavy clipboard, flipping past a laminated title sheet. "Martin and his private real estate investment group own this dirt." Now the foreman snapped coldly, tapping the thick clipboard against his leg. "They fast-tracked the municipal permits this morning, and we are breaking ground the second the holiday weekend is over. So do yourself a huge favor, old man. Go home, drink some warm tea, and stay far away from this construction site." I nodded meekly, keeping my eyes fixed on the frozen ground. "Thank you, sir," I whispered softly. "I will just go home and stay out of your way." I turned around and began my slow, shuffling retreat toward the crumbling brick wall where my car was hidden. I did not look back. I listened to the heavy hydraulic drill roar back to life behind me, tearing violently into the earth. I maintained the fragile walk until I was completely concealed by the shadows of the abandoned warehouse district. Then my posture straightened entirely. Martin. He was my ex-wife, new husband. The depressed man my daughter said needed a peaceful Christmas. The betrayal went very deep. My entire family was planning my absolute slaughter. I reached my car and unlocked the door with stiff, freezing fingers. I slid into the driver's seat, turning the heater up to maximum setting to chase the deep chill from my bones. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned completely white. My mind raced through the implications of what I had just learned. Martin was not just a passive, depressed stepfather. He was a ruthless real estate broker actively managing the hostile takeover of my property. Valerie had banned me from my own family holiday gathering, using his fictional mental fragility as the ultimate emotional weapon. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Warren again. He answered immediately. "Warren," I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth. "I just left the South Side lot. The corporate buyers have already broken ground, and the private real estate group overseeing the entire operation belongs to Martin." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Your former wife, new husband," Warren asked, clarifying the connection. "Yes," I replied. "I need you to dig into his financial records immediately. Dig into everything. Look at his recent corporate transactions, his shell companies, his offshore accounts. I want to know exactly how he connects back to Derek and Valerie. Do not leave a single stone unturned. I am heading back to your office right now." I ended the call and pulled out of the shadows of the warehouse district. The drive back to downtown Chicago felt much faster this time. The burning anger inside my chest kept me sharply focused. I was no longer a confused victim. I was a man actively hunting the people who were trying to destroy him. When I returned to the windowless archive room, Warren was surrounded by stacks of printed ledgers and glowing monitors. He had pulled every available municipal financial record connected to Derek and cross-referenced them with Martin and his corporate holdings. "Take a seat," Richard Warren said quietly. His voice carried a dark, serious weight that immediately put me on high alert. "You were right to ask me to look into Martin. But the situation is vastly more dangerous than a simple family land grab. Derek and Valerie are not just acting out of sheer greed. They are acting out of absolute sheer desperation." I sat down and looked at the complex financial web Warren had projected onto the large screen on the wall. "Explain it to me," I commanded. Warren pointed to a series of massive municipal infrastructure funds managed directly by Derek. Over the past 3 years, Derek has been quietly siphoning millions of dollars from city construction budgets. He moved the money through a complex network of dummy vendor accounts. He thought he was a financial genius. He took the embezzled city funds and dumped them into highly volatile stock market investments, hoping to double the money and quietly replace the stolen principal before anyone noticed. I stared at the screen, feeling a sickening realization wash over me. "But he lost it," I said, finishing the thought. Warren nodded slowly. "He lost everything. The market took a massive dive last quarter. Derek is currently sitting on a $15 million deficit. The city controller is scheduling a routine municipal audit for the middle of January. When those auditors open the infrastructure ledgers, they will immediately discover the massive hole in the accounts. Derek is facing 20 years in federal prison for grand larceny, embezzlement, and municipal fraud." I leaned back in my chair, absorbing the staggering reality of my son-in-law and his catastrophic failure. I was a desperate, drowning man. "But how does my land fit into his rescue plan?" I asked. "And where exactly does Martin come in?" Warren swiped his hand across his tablet, pulling up a completely different set of banking records. These records were heavily encrypted, sourced from offshore accounts linked directly to Martin and his real estate group. "When Derek realized he was facing federal prison, he panicked," Warren explained. "He went to Martin for a discreet bailout, but Martin did not have $15 million in liquid cash. What Martin did have were connections to the dark, unregulated underbelly of the commercial real estate world. He acted as a dirty broker for a massive cartel-backed investment syndicate operating out of the shadows. This specific syndicate actively launders illicit money by purchasing prime commercial real estate through legitimate corporate fronts." I felt my stomach drop. The men funding the tech conglomerate purchase were not just ruthless businessmen. They were dangerous, violent criminals. Warren continued tracing the digital money trail on the screen. Martin approached the syndicate with a highly lucrative proposition. He promised them a guaranteed, fast-tracked purchase of the most valuable tech commercial plot in Chicago. Your 50 acres. Because Derek controls city zoning, he could guarantee the corporate permits. The syndicate agreed to the purchase. To secure the deal, they paid Derek a massive under-the-table cash advance. Warren tapped the screen one final time. A bank statement appeared showing a clean, untraceable wire transfer. $5 million, Warren said softly. The cartel gave Derek a $5 million non-refundable advance to hold off his municipal auditors. The remaining $10 million required to completely cover his massive embezzlement deficit will be paid the exact moment the property deed is officially transferred. The pieces of the horrifying puzzle finally locked together. My daughter and her husband were trapped in a deadly financial vice. They had accepted millions of dollars from a ruthless criminal syndicate. Now they were absolutely obligated to deliver my land to satisfy their dangerous creditors. But they could not simply ask me to sell. They knew I would never agree to rush a sale of my property to shady investors. They needed absolute, unchecked legal control over my entire estate to force the sale through immediately. That was why they needed the medical power of attorney. That was why they were trying to declare me mentally incompetent. They were legally sacrificing my life to save their own skin. I looked at the date on the offshore transfer receipt. I noticed a specific contract contingency clause highlighted in bright yellow at the bottom of the page. What happens if Derek fails to deliver the signed deed? I asked. my voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. Warren looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated grimness. The cartel does not use the court system when someone breaches a multi-million-dollar contract, Richard. If Derek fails to finalize the transfer, they will not just sue him for the $5 million advance. They will eliminate him, and they will eliminate Valerie. The syndicate has given them a strict deadline to produce the legally binding property deed. I stared at the blinking cursor on the screen. "When is the deadline?" I asked. Warren took a deep breath before answering. "Christmas Eve," he said quietly. "They must deliver the fully executed deed by midnight on Christmas Eve. If they do not produce the documents, the cartel will come to collect their debt in blood." I left Warren in the windowless archive room and drove back to my empty house. The deadline pressed on my chest like a physical weight. Christmas Eve. My daughter needed control of my estate before the holiday, and she was willing to destroy my mind to get it. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. But before I could even take off my winter boots, the loud doorbell rang. I glanced through this peephole. It was Valerie holding a cheap cherry pie. She had a bright, fabricated smile plastered across her face. I smoothed my expression into the fragile old man she expected and opened the door. "Dad, it is so good to see you," Valerie said, pushing past me. She gave me a stiff hug. "I brought you your favorite pie. I know we had a difficult conversation about Christmas dinner today. I wanted to make sure you were not lonely." She set the pie on the counter. I followed her slowly. If I had not spent the afternoon looking at cartel wire transfers, I might have believed this charade. But knowing the truth made her performance chilling. She was strictly here to monitor her intended target. "Thank you, Valerie," I said softly. "That is very thoughtful of you. I am doing fine. I was actually just thinking about the future." Valerie turned around, slowly leaning against the kitchen island, her eyes darting over my face. "What do you mean by the future, Dad?" she asked cautiously. I needed to see how she would react when her plans were threatened. "I have been feeling remarkably sharp lately," I told her. "My mind has not felt this clear in years. I am thinking of calling my attorney after the new year begins. I want to officially update my will. I will put everything I own, including the South Side industrial lot, directly into a secure trust for you and Derek. We just need to wait until January." The reaction was instantaneous. The color drained from her cheeks. Her eyes widened in absolute. January was useless to her. By January, the cartel would have already collected their blood debt. She needed me legally incapacitated right now. "Dad, you cannot do that," Valerie blurted out. She caught herself forcing a patronizing tone. "You should not be worrying about complex legal matters right now. You have been so confused lately. Do you not remember just this morning you were struggling to find your glasses?" "I found them under the table," I replied smoothly. "That is my point," she insisted, placing a hand on my arm. "You are forgetting things. Your memory is slipping faster than you realize. Derek and I are worried about your cognitive health. You need to rest and let us handle the heavy burdens. It is time for your evening medication. You should not miss a dose." She did not hesitate for a single second. She walked directly to the wooden medicine cabinet where I kept my daily heart pills. I stood quietly near the doorway, watching her back. I intentionally kept a silver toaster on the counter, polishing it so the surface acted like a mirror. I watched her reflection. She opened the cabinet. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, unlabeled orange bottle. She opened my legitimate heart medication. With quick, practiced movements, she poured my actual pills into her pocket. Then she refilled my bottle with generic-looking white pills from her secret stash. I recognized those white pills. They were prescription-grade sedatives used to chemically restrain confused patients. If I took those daily within 48 hours, I would be slurring my words, stumbling, and unable to remember my own name. I would become the exact living proof of severe dementia that Derek needed to validate his fraudulent power of attorney. Valerie closed the cabinet and turned around, holding a glass of water and my freshly spiked pill bottle. "Here you go, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Take your medicine. We need to keep you safe." I took them, my hands shaking, but this time the tremor was not an act. The sheer evil radiating from my own daughter was suffocating. She was not a victim of her husband. She was the calculating mastermind attempting to chemically destroy my brain. I sat heavily in my chair, placing the glass and the spiked bottle on the wood. Valerie hovered over me like a vulture, waiting for an animal to stop breathing. I knew I could not simply refuse to take the pill. I needed an undeniable distraction. I carefully reached for the glass, pretending my grip was incredibly weak. I let my fingers slip. The heavy glass tipped over, crashing onto the floor and shattering into sharp pieces. Water splashed everywhere, soaking the bottom of Valerie and her expensive shoes. "Oh no," I cried out, shrinking back in my chair. "I am so sorry, Valerie." My hands simply gave out. "Please do not accidentally step on the sharp glass." Valerie let out a sharp sound of disgust. She jumped back frantically, brushing the cold water off her trousers. "Dad, look what you just did," she snapped, her mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "Just stay right there. Let me get a towel." She spun around and marched toward the pantry to grab a mop. The moment her back was turned, my hands moved with the speed of a man half my age. I reached into my pocket, where I kept a spare, identical bottle of my actual heart medication. I seamlessly swapped the spiked bottle on the table with my safe bottle. I popped one of my legitimate pills into my mouth and swallowed it dry just as Valerie marched back carrying a towel. She threw the wet towel onto the puddle, glaring at me with poorly concealed contempt. I tapped the now completely empty bottle on the polished wooden table. "I took my medicine, sweetheart," I said softly. "I am feeling very tired now. I think I will just go upstairs to my bedroom and go to sleep." Valerie looked at the empty bottle. A chilling, victorious smile slowly spread across her face. The panic from earlier was completely gone, replaced by the smug satisfaction of a predator that had successfully cornered its prey. "Good boy, Dad," she whispered, picking up the wet towel. "You just get some rest now. The medicine will help your mind calm down. I will come back tomorrow to check on you." She grabbed her coat and walked out the front door, leaving the cheap pie sitting untouched on the counter. I sat alone in the quiet dining room, staring at the spiked bottle of heavy sedatives I had safely tucked away inside my pocket. The reality settled over me like a suffocating blanket. Valerie was not trying to save her family. She was actively trying to execute her father. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. I closed my eyes and let the last remaining trace of paternal affection completely die. Now I was going to ensure she completely and utterly lost absolutely everything. I sat in the windowless archive room, letting the heavy silence settle over the glowing computer screens. Warren looked at me across the desk, the harsh light reflecting in his glasses. He told me we needed to contact the Chicago police immediately. He insisted we had gathered more than enough digital evidence of municipal fraud, severe embezzlement, and attempted elder abuse to lock Derek and Valerie behind bars for decades. He argued that taking the evidence to the district attorney would freeze their plans and save my property. But I shook my head. I knew the bureaucratic reality of the city I had worked in for 40 years. Derek was a high-ranking zoning commissioner. He routinely had lunches with local judges. He played golf with police captains. If we filed a local injunction, his defense lawyers would easily stall the proceedings in the corrupt municipal courts for months. The ruthless cartel backing the technology conglomerate buyout would not wait for a local judge to untangle a family dispute. They demanded the signed property deed by Christmas Eve. If a legal battle paused the transfer, they would simply eliminate the human obstacle. I was the obstacle. I told Warren that playing a defensive legal game in a corrupted city was a guaranteed death sentence. We needed a completely different strategy. We needed to introduce a massive player into this dangerous game that was entirely untouchable. A supreme power so overwhelming and absolute that neither Derek nor his violent cartel investors could ever manipulate it. Warren leaned forward, firmly lacing his fingers together on the wooden desk. He asked me exactly what I was suggesting we do. I told him we were not going to sell the land to a third party. If I suddenly sold the 50 acres for millions of dollars, the violent syndicate would track the massive influx of cash into my bank accounts. They would force my deceitful daughter to steal those liquid assets using the fraudulent medical power of attorney she and her husband were holding. To win this war, I had to permanently destroy the commercial value of the property for the tech conglomerate while making the land entirely untouchable by local politicians. I looked at the digital zoning map displayed on the monitor. I told Warren I wanted to irrevocably donate the entire parcel to the United States federal government, specifically to the Department of Veterans Affairs. Once that dirt officially became federal property, no corrupt city commissioner or shadowy real estate syndicate could lay a single finger on it without triggering a federal investigation. Warren smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile that reminded me exactly why he was considered the most feared corporate litigator in the entire state. He closed his laptop and told me to pack a small travel bag. We drove to the airport and bought 2 first-class tickets to Washington using untraceable cash. We needed to move completely undetected. If Derek got even a slight hint that I was leaving the state, he would execute the fake power of attorney early. We silently boarded the very quiet evening flight, leaving the freezing Chicago winter entirely behind. The next morning, we walked confidently through the imposing marble corridors of the Department of Veterans Affairs in the nation capital. Warren had spent the entire flight cashing in every political favor he had accumulated over his 40-year legal career. He successfully secured a closed-door emergency meeting with an influential federal director. We were quickly escorted into a massive conference room overlooking the historic monuments. The director, a serious military veteran with a stern face and sharp eyes, sat directly across from us. He looked skeptical, clearly wondering why a retired structural engineer and a corporate lawyer had demanded an urgent audience on such short notice. I did not waste his time with empty pleasantries. I opened my heavy leather briefcase and slid the official original property deed across the polished table. I told him I owned 50 acres of prime, commercially zoned land located right in the Chicago metropolitan area. I placed the recent municipal appraisals right next to the deed, clearly displaying the staggering valuation of $120 million. The director slowly picked up the papers, his skeptical expression rapidly shifting into absolute shock as he read the certified numbers. I told him I wanted to make an immediate binding and irrevocable donation of the entire property to the federal government. I stated that I had only one strict condition for the transfer. The land could never be sold to private developers. It had to be used exclusively to build a massive medical campus for disabled veterans. The director lowered the documents, staring at me in complete silence. He asked me why a private citizen would give away a fortune of that magnitude without asking for tax subsidies or public compensation in return. I looked him directly in the eyes. I told him that I was an old man who had spent his entire life building strong foundations only to watch my own family try to tear them down out of pure greed. I told him I wanted my final legacy to be something that genuinely helped people who had sacrificed for their country, rather than enriching criminals who only knew how to steal. The sincerity in my voice must have deeply resonated with him. General Vance did not immediately speak. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair, his piercing gaze shifting from the municipal appraisal documents to my face, searching for any hidden agenda. In Washington, nobody gave away a 9-figure asset purely out of the goodness of their heart. There was always a catch, a tax loophole, or a political favor expected in return. But as he studied the unblinking resolve in my eyes, he realized I was not a politician seeking leverage. I was a father initiating a scorched earth protocol. If we accept this donation, Mr. Sullivan, General Vance finally said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone, we are taking on whatever heat is currently attached to this parcel. You mentioned corrupt municipal officials. The Department of Veterans Affairs is a massive entity, but we do not blindly step into local zoning wars without heavy legal armor. This was the exact moment Warren stepped forward, unzipping his battered briefcase with the predatory grace of a great white shark sensing blood in the water. "You won't be stepping into a zoning war, General," Warren stated smoothly, sliding a thick, meticulously drafted legal binder across the table. "You will be deploying a nuclear deterrent. I have spent the last 12 hours drafting what corporate litigators refer to as an ironclad poison pill. This transfer document does not just hand over the deed. It contains a self-executing federal supremacy clause." General Vance opened the binder, his legal counsel leaning in closely over his shoulder. "Explain it to me in plain English, Counselor," Vance commanded. "If any municipal zoning commissioner, private developer, or third-party entity attempts to contest this federal acquisition file, an injunction, or claim prior developmental rights," Warren explained, tapping the specific page with his index finger, "the deed automatically triggers an immediate mandatory Department of Justice investigation into the contesting party. By signing this document, the federal government officially classifies the 50 acres as critical national security infrastructure for veteran rehabilitation. Anyone who tries to touch that dirt will immediately face federal racketeering charges, obstruction of justice, and the comprehensive forensic audit by the FBI." The chief legal counsel's eyes widened as she read the clauses. It was a masterpiece of aggressive corporate defense law weaponized for federal use. It essentially turned my 50 acres into a legal minefield that would instantly obliterate anyone foolish enough to step on it. "It is a one-way trip, General," I added quietly. "I am locking the door from the inside and handing you the only key. The people trying to steal this land operate in the shadows. They thrive on local municipal corruption and under-the-table bribes. They cannot bribe the federal government. They cannot intimidate the United States military apparatus. Once your seal is on that paper, their entire criminal conspiracy hits a reinforced concrete wall at 200 miles per hour. A slow, dangerous smile crept across General Vance's face. He was a military man who despised local corruption, and we had just handed him the ultimate weapon to crush it, while securing a massive victory for disabled veterans. He immediately picked up his desk phone and called his chief legal counsel into the room. For the next 5 hours we sat in that conference room, drafting the most aggressive and impenetrable transfer documents Warren had ever engineered. The federal lawyers were thrilled by the massive acquisition, but Warren raised his hand, bringing the cheerful celebration to a sudden halt. He pointed out the critical timeline we were operating under. I explained that my corrupt son-in-law was currently holding a fraudulent medical power of attorney. If Derek filed that dangerous document in Chicago before the federal transfer was fully finalized, the donation would be legally contested in court for years. To fast-track the acceptance protocols through the highest levels of the federal department. But Warren insisted on one final crucial detail. The transfer could not just be signed in a secret boardroom. It had to be sealed and announced on a massive public stage. We had to create a media event so loud and official that the cartel would immediately realize the land was permanently lost. We shook hands with the federal team and left the building. The trap was finally set. The massive gears of the federal government were actively moving into place to crush my greedy son-in-law. But as we boarded our quiet flight back to Chicago, I knew the most dangerous part of the war was just beginning. We were racing against a ticking clock. Christmas Eve was approaching fast. My daughter and her husband firmly believed they were days away from becoming wealthy. They had absolutely no idea that the old man they thought they were manipulating had just handed their entire future over to the federal government. I stood on the frozen pavement outside the downtown bank branch, watching my breath form pale clouds in the bitter morning air. Yesterday, my son-in-law had frozen my entire financial existence, leaving me stranded without a single dollar to my name. Derek believed he had successfully crippled me, isolating me so he could steal my $120 million property. He was terribly wrong. I pushed open the heavy glass doors. Warren walked right beside me. My old friend wore a long wool coat and carried his battered leather briefcase. His expression was a mask of pure predatory anticipation. He had spent 40 years destroying corporate executives in courtrooms. We walked directly toward the glass-walled offices at the back. The executive manager was sitting behind his desk, typing. I knew this manager. His name was Harrison. He had handled my business accounts for a decade, greeting me with accommodating smiles. But today, his smile vanished. It was replaced by a tight, nervous grimace. Derek had obviously gotten to him. Derek had used his municipal influence to secure a quiet, immediate freeze on my assets, likely promising Harrison a lucrative cut of the impending real estate transaction. Richard Harrison said, standing up slowly and smoothing his expensive tie. I am so sorry about the situation with your accounts yesterday, but you must understand my hands are completely tied. Your son-in-law brought in some very distressing medical paperwork. We have a legal obligation to protect vulnerable seniors when a medical power of attorney is invoked. I stepped aside and let Warren take the lead. Warren dropped his heavy leather briefcase onto Harrison's pristine desk with a loud echoing thud. Cut the patronizing nonsense, Harrison Warren stated, his voice a low, threatening rumble. You initiated a hard freeze on a multi-million-dollar portfolio without a secondary judicial review. You bypassed standard banking protocols because a city commissioner handed you a piece of paper. Now you are going to open your secure filing cabinet, and you are going to show us the original physical document. Derek submitted to authorize this freeze. Harrison bristled, his face flushing with a mix of anger and sudden panic. He looked at me, expecting the confused old man Derek had described. He found only unwavering stone. I do not have to show you anything, Harrison countered defensively, though his voice wavered slightly. This is an active protective hold. The documents are highly sensitive and under internal review by regional compliance. Warren leaned across the desk, invading the manager's personal space. Do not lie to me, Warren whispered coldly. You did not send that document anywhere. You kept the original physical copy right here in your branch vault to maintain absolute control over the transaction. Bring out the physical folder right now, or my next phone call is to the Federal Banking Commission. The threat of a federal banking investigation drained the remaining color from Harrison's face. He knew his career would instantly evaporate. He swallowed hard, turned around with trembling hands, and unlocked the heavy steel filing cabinet behind his desk. He pulled out a green folder and placed it on the table. Here it is, Harrison snapped, trying to regain a fraction of his lost authority. A legally binding medical power of attorney signed by Richard himself. You can look at it all you want, but it changes absolutely nothing about the account freeze. I stepped forward. I looked down at the premium paper I had seen in my dining room exactly 3 days ago. I slowly flipped open the heavy cover, turning past the medical clauses and the asset liquidation permissions until I reached page 4. I turned the document around so it faced Harrison directly. I tapped my index finger firmly on the designated signature line at the bottom of the page. The line was perfectly blank. The fading friction ink from my specialized drafting pen had completely vanished, evaporating exactly as it was designed to do after 48 hours of ambient light exposure. There was absolutely no signature. There was no consent. The paper was absolutely worthless. Harrison stared at the blank page. He blinked rapidly, leaning closer, as if expecting the ink to suddenly materialize out of thin air. He flipped to the previous pages, frantically searching the other signature lines. Blank. Every single one of them was a pristine, empty void. But he signed it. Harrison stammered, his voice cracking with genuine terror as he looked up at me. Derek told me he watched you sign it with his own eyes. I processed the digital scan yesterday morning. It had your signature on it. The scan showed your name. A digital scan captures a frozen moment in time. Warren explained, his tone laced with absolute mockery. But original physical documents are the only things that hold up in a court of law. and the physical document you are currently holding is completely blank. You froze the accounts of a highly respected municipal engineer based on a void, unexecuted piece of paper. That is not just a procedural banking error, Harrison. That is a massive, actionable breach of fiduciary duty. I finally spoke, letting my voice carry the heavy, commanding weight of my 4 decades in construction management. You are going to lift the freeze on my accounts right this second, I demanded quietly. You are going to restore my full access, and you are going to permanently delete any internal record of this fraudulent power of attorney. If I check my balance on my phone in exactly 2 minutes and the funds are not available, Warren will systematically dismantle your entire life in federal court. Harrison did not argue. He did not try to explain. He practically fell into his leather chair, his hands shaking violently as he typed his administrative override codes into the banking system. The mechanical clicking of the keyboard was the only sound in the tense room. Less than a minute later, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and opened my banking application. My liquid assets, every single dollar I had earned over a lifetime of hard work, were fully restored and accessible. We had successfully broken the financial chokehold. Warren picked up the thick green folder containing the blank documents, tucked it neatly under his arm, and turned toward the door. We are taking the physical evidence with us, Warren stated firmly. Enjoy your holiday, Harrison. I suggest you spend it reflecting on your terrible professional choices. We walked out of the glass office, leaving the corrupt manager sitting in paralyzed silence. We crossed the marble floor and stepped back out into the freezing Chicago snow. As we walked toward my car, a chilling realization settled over me. Harrison had mentioned processing a digital scan yesterday morning. Derek had photographed the signed papers immediately after leaving my house, back when the fading ink was still completely visible. He had undoubtedly sent that exact digital file directly to Martin and the dangerous cartel investors to prove he had secured legal control of my estate. Derek firmly believed he held a winning hand. The trap was perfectly set for his absolute destruction. The morning of December 23rd arrived with a bitter, biting wind that rattled the old wooden window frames of my silent house. I sat alone at my kitchen island, nursing a cup of black coffee. He had deployed the fraudulent power of attorney with ruthless efficiency, firmly believing he had successfully isolated me from the rest of the world. I was currently operating under the absolute certainty that his digital scan of a blank piece of paper would magically satisfy a violent criminal syndicate. I needed to ensure he maintained that dangerous level of supreme arrogance for just 36 more hours. If Derek or Valerie suspected for even a single second that I had broken their financial freeze or that I was actively fighting back, they might panic and abort the cartel meeting. I needed them completely relaxed, utterly confident, and perfectly positioned for the final blow. I set my coffee mug down on the granite counter and picked up my cell phone. It was time to feed the predators exactly what they wanted to eat. I opened my text message thread with my daughter. The screen was glaringly empty. She had not sent a single message to check on my well-being since the night she tried to secretly poison my mind with heavy sedatives. Her silence was a calculated maneuver to maintain distance while she plotted my downfall. I took a deep breath, steadying my hands, and began to type. I carefully crafted a message designed to surrender my dignity completely. I typed the words slowly. I feel dizzy today. I think you are right about my memory slipping. I can barely remember what happened yesterday. I am just going to stay in bed until after New Year. Please do not worry about me. Have a wonderful Christmas. I stared at the glowing screen for a long time before pressing send. Sending that message felt like burying the last remaining fraction of the father I used to be. I was voluntarily handing my daughter the ultimate psychological victory. I was giving her the explicit confirmation that her cruel gaslighting was working perfectly. I knew exactly how that message would be received in her lavish mansion. Across the city, Valerie would be sitting in her modern, sunlit kitchen. Her phone would buzz. She would pick it up, read my pathetic words of surrender, and a massive wave of euphoric relief would wash over her. She would immediately show the screen to Derek. They would probably share a celebratory embrace right there in their kitchen. In their minds, the final pesky obstacle standing between them and a $120 million payday had just voluntarily neutralized itself. The old man was broken bedridden and legally incapacitated. Their path to the Christmas Eve closing with the cartel was now completely clear and unopposed. They would spend the rest of the day in a state of greedy anticipation. Valerie would begin planning how to decorate the house for her criminal guests, ensuring the champagne was adequately chilled and the crystal glasses were perfectly polished for their midnight celebration. Derek would organize his fraudulent documents, practicing his confident handshake for the men who had paid him a $5 million bribe. They would dress in their finest holiday clothes, completely blind to the reality that they were actively preparing for their own funeral. Inside the mansion, the afternoon hours ticked by in a haze of manic, luxurious preparation. Valerie stood alone in her massive gourmet kitchen, running her manicured fingers over the chilled surface of the vintage champagne bottles she had specifically ordered for the midnight toast. The house was unnervingly quiet. Derek was upstairs in his study, obsessively pacing the floor as he rehearsed his final pitch to the cartel lawyers, while the twin boys had been conveniently sent away to a ski resort with their nanny. Valerie wanted absolutely no distractions tonight. She poured herself a small glass of white wine to steady her nerves, staring at her reflection in the dark granite countertops. For a fleeting fraction of a second, the image of her elderly father shivering, confused, and heavily sedated in his empty house flashed across her mind. She thought about the unlabeled orange bottle she had slipped into his medicine cabinet, but any trace of lingering guilt was instantly suffocated by an overwhelming surge of cold, calculated self-preservation. She walked through her opulent dining room, admiring the imported crystal chandelier and the velvet drapes. She had grown accustomed to this lifestyle. She had built her entire identity around being the wealthy, untouchable wife of a powerful city commissioner. When Derek confessed his catastrophic $15 million embezzlement to her 3 weeks ago, sobbing on their bedroom floor, Valerie hadn't panicked. Instead, she had coldly assessed the situation. Her father's forgotten land was the only viable life raft. To Valerie, her father had already lived his life. He was old, retired, and comfortably wealthy. In the dark, twisted arithmetic of her mind, sacrificing his final years in a locked psychiatric ward was a perfectly acceptable price to pay to maintain her status and keep her husband out of a federal penitentiary. "He owes me this," Valerie whispered to the empty room, taking a sip of the wine. "He spent his whole life working for the family. This is just one last contribution." The grand delusion was completely intoxicating. She firmly believed she was the smartest person in her family, lineage effortlessly outmaneuvering an aging structural engineer who still did crossword puzzles in pen. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy oak front doors opened, and Martin arrived. He did not look like the confident broker who had orchestrated the cartel deal. He looked terrible. His face was pale, glistening with a cold sweat, and his hands shook visibly as he took off his expensive cashmere overcoat. He immediately marched to the wet bar and poured himself 3 fingers of neat scotch, swallowing it in one desperate gulp. "They are already in the city," Martin muttered, his eyes darting toward the heavy snow falling outside the window. "I just got a ping from the syndicate's lead counsel. 3 unmarked black SUVs crossed the city limits 10 minutes ago. They don't play games, Valerie. If Derek's paperwork isn't absolutely flawless tonight, they will not negotiate. They will just lock the doors." Valerie scoffed, rolling her eyes at her stepfather's paranoia. She walked over and dismissively straightened his crooked silk tie. "Relax, Martin," she said, her voice dripping with unearned supreme arrogance. "Derek has the physical folder locked in his wall safe. The ink is dry. The old man is completely incapacitated. By this time tomorrow, the cartel will have their dirt. The city auditors will be paid off, and we will be booking a first-class flight to the Maldives for New Year's. We won. Now act like a winner before our guests arrive." While they were busy preparing to sell my stolen legacy to the highest bidder, I walked slowly up the wooden stairs to my master bedroom. I opened the heavy doors of my walk-in closet. I bypassed my comfortable daily sweaters and my worn construction jackets. I reached into the very back of the dark closet and pulled out a thick protective garment bag. I unzipped the protective canvas slowly. Inside hung a pristine, custom-tailored charcoal gray suit. I had commissioned this specific suit 5 years ago for a major municipal engineering gala. It was an incredibly expensive garment, stitched perfectly, to complement my tall frame and broad shoulders. It was constructed from premium Italian wool cut, with an exacting precision that demanded absolute respect. It was not the attire of a confused, stumbling senior citizen. It was the armor of a man who commanded authority. I ran my hands over the smooth fabric, feeling the sharp crease of the lapels. Tonight, I was going to rest. But tomorrow, on Christmas, I would put this armor on. I would walk onto a brightly lit stage in front of the entire city, and I would execute the final maneuver of my life. I carried the heavy suit carefully across the room and draped it over the edge of my freshly made bed. I selected a crisp, perfectly starched white dress shirt and a muted silver tie to complete the ensemble. Every single detail needed to be absolutely flawless. When I stood in front of the television cameras tomorrow evening to donate my land to the federal government, I needed to project unquestionable cognitive clarity. The entire world needed to see a sharp, highly competent engineer voluntarily surrendering his wealth to a noble cause. They needed to see a man completely in control of his own destiny. My phone suddenly vibrated in my pocket, pulling my attention away from the tailored suit. It was a secure message from Warren. The text was incredibly brief, containing only 2 short sentences. "The Eagles have safely landed. We are moving to the staging area." A cold, deeply satisfying shiver ran down my spine. The federal agents had officially arrived in Chicago. Warren had spent the last 24 hours coordinating discreetly with the highest levels of the Department of Veterans Affairs and their corresponding federal law enforcement liaisons. They had flown into the city under a veil of absolute secrecy, bypassing the corrupt municipal police departments entirely. A team of highly trained federal prosecutors and senior directors were currently settling into a secure private boardroom at a downtown hotel, finalizing the massive stacks of irrevocable transfer documents. The stage was now perfectly set. The unmovable force of the United States federal government was officially positioned right inside my city, waiting quietly in the shadows. They were prepared to execute a legal maneuver that would instantly vaporize millions of dollars in criminal assets. All they needed was my physical presence and my authorized signature to legally seize the 50 acres of land. And right across town, in a sprawling, falsely secure mansion, my daughter and her husband were blissfully arranging their crystal glasses, eagerly waiting to hand that exact same land over to a violent criminal syndicate. The collision of these 2 massive opposing forces was now entirely inevitable. The cold winter clock was quickly ticking down the final tense hours. I walked over to the bedroom window and looked out at the frozen, darkening streets of my neighborhood. The snow was beginning to fall again, covering the city in a deceptive layer of pristine white. But beneath that beautiful surface, a brutal reckoning was rapidly approaching. Tomorrow night, the truth would finally shatter their perfect little illusion. Tomorrow night, there will be absolutely no mercy for any of them. The evening of December 24th arrived with a heavy snowfall that blanketed the city of Chicago in a thick layer of pristine white. Inside the lavish mansion of my daughter, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive pine and unearned victory. It was exactly 10 in the evening now. Valerie had spent the entire afternoon meticulously arranging her grand dining room to host the most dangerous guests of her life. The long mahogany table was set with fine crystal glasses and imported holiday centerpieces. A bottle of vintage champagne sat chilling in a silver bucket, waiting to consecrate a transaction that was built entirely on a foundation of profound family betrayal. Valerie moved through the opulent room wearing a stunning emerald green designer dress. She smiled brightly, playing the role of the perfect and gracious hostess. Standing near the roaring fireplace was her husband Derek. He wore a sharp tuxedo, swirling a glass of scotch, radiating the arrogant confidence of a man who firmly believed he had outsmarted everyone. Standing right beside him was Martin, the new husband of my former wife. The supposedly fragile man whose delicate mental state had been the cruel excuse used to banish me from my own family holiday. Martin was not crying in a corner tonight. He was standing tall, laughing loudly, playing the role of the master broker who had successfully orchestrated the ultimate real estate heist. Sitting stiffly around the dining table were three men who did not match the festive holiday decor. They were the cartel lawyers. They wore dark suits and possessed the cold eyes of men who solved multi-million-dollar corporate disputes with extreme violence. They did not touch the champagne. They did not marvel at the towering Christmas tree. They were purely there to collect their property. Martin had successfully brought them to the table, and Derek was finally ready to deliver the prize. At that exact moment, miles away from the quiet wealth of that mansion, I was standing in a brightly lit backstage holding room at Chicago City Hall. The harsh contrast between her deceitful holiday party and my current reality was staggering. I was not sitting alone in my dark house shivering and confused. I was wearing my flawless, custom-tailored charcoal gray suit. My posture was perfectly straight, and my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. I was not surrounded by dangerous criminals. I was flanked on my right by the governor of Illinois. Standing on my left was the senior director of the United States Department of Veterans Affairs, accompanied by a dedicated team of elite federal prosecutors. The room was buzzing with the focused electric energy of a massive governmental operation. Warren stood near the doorway, holding his battered leather briefcase, watching the preparations with a look of deep, cynical satisfaction. Through the heavy wooden doors of the holding room, I could hear the loud, chaotic murmur of the assembled press corps. Every major news network had deployed their top reporters to the City Hall press briefing room on Christmas Eve. The federal public relations team had teased a historic and unprecedented charitable donation, guaranteeing a massive viewing audience. The cameras were already rolling. The bright stage lights were fully ignited. The unmovable force of the federal government was entirely mobilized and ready to strike. I took a deep and steadying breath, listening to the muffled sounds of the journalists outside. I thought about Valerie. I thought about the cheap cherry pie she had left on my counter. I thought about the orange bottle of heavy sedatives she had tried to force down my throat. I felt a fleeting, microscopic pang of paternal sorrow for the little girl she used to be, but it vanished instantly, completely burned away by the cold reality of the woman she had chosen to become. She wanted to erase my legal existence. Tonight, I was going to legally erase her entire future. Back at the mansion, the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed clearly, signaling 10:15. The lead cartel lawyer checked his heavy silver watch. He looked directly at Derek, his expression completely devoid of any holiday cheer. "The pleasantries are entirely over," Derek the lawyer stated, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that instantly silenced the festive music playing in the background. "We provided the $5 million advance. We provided the necessary corporate shielding. It is time for you to provide the executed property deed for the 50 acres of land. If the paperwork is not completely finalized and handed over to us by midnight, our employers will consider this a fatal breach of contract." The tension in the room spiked immediately. The remaining warmth evaporated from the air. Valerie swallowed hard, her artificial smile faltering as she instinctively took a step closer to Martin. The looming threat of cartel violence was no longer an abstract corporate concept. It was sitting right inside her dining room, staring directly at her husband. Derek did not sweat. He did not hesitate. He simply offered the cartel lawyers a smooth, rehearsed smile. "Gentlemen, there is absolutely no need for hostility on such a beautiful Christmas Eve," Derek said confidently. The transaction is completely secured. I have the fully executed medical power of attorney right here. My father-in-law gave his entire estate over to me 3 weeks ago. I have full uncontested legal authority to transfer the deed to your syndicate tonight. Derek turned his back on the intimidating men and walked over to the heavy steel wall safe hidden behind a piece of modern art in his private study. He quickly punched in the numeric keypad combination. The heavy metal bolts clicked loudly and the secure door swung open. Inside the vault rested the thick green legal folder he had aggressively snatched from my dining room table 21 days ago. Derek reached into the safe and pulled out the green folder. He felt the heavy premium weight of the paper in his hands. He felt the certainty of his impending victory. He was holding his salvation. He was holding his freedom from a massive federal embezzlement charge. He was holding the key to a lifetime of unearned luxury. He walked back into the grand dining room, carrying the folder like a triumphant trophy. He approached the mahogany table, where the cartel lawyers waited with their pens ready. He did not know that the ink from my specialized drafting pen had completely evaporated 48 hours after he left my house. He did not know that I had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously transferring the actual property deed to the Department of Veterans Affairs. He did not know that I was currently stepping up to a podium on live television to announce that very transfer to the entire nation. Derek smiled arrogantly at the dangerous men sitting at his table. He placed his hand on the cover of the green folder, completely unaware that he had not actually looked at the signature line on page 4 in exactly 3 weeks. He prepared to open the folder and hand them a perfectly blank piece of paper. The 3 men sitting at the table did not return his smile. They sat perfectly still. The lead lawyer extended a single hand. The gesture was an absolute command to surrender the document. Derek confidently slid the folder across the polished wood. He stepped back into the shadows, sliding his hands into the pockets of his tuxedo pants, fully expecting a firm handshake. The lead lawyer pulled the folder toward him. He opened the cover with slow, methodical precision. The room fell into suffocating silence. Valerie held her breath near the roaring fireplace. The lawyer flipped past the dense legal jargon. He reached page 4, the page containing the ultimate legal authority, dictating the complete surrender of my entire estate, my freedom, and my $120 million parcel. The lawyer stared at the paper for a very long time. The silence grew heavier and more dangerous with every passing second. The 2 other men subtly shifted their weight, their hands resting quietly near the inside pockets of their jackets. Valerie nervously smoothed the fabric of her emerald green dress. The triumphant energy rapidly evaporated. The lead lawyer slowly closed the green folder. He placed his hands flat on the polished table. He looked up at Derek. His dark eyes were completely empty. "Is this a joke?" Derek the lawyer asked. His voice was a flat, terrifying whisper that echoed loudly in the quiet room. Derek frowned, pulling his hands out of his pockets. He let out a nervous laugh. "A joke," Derek repeated. "I do not understand what you mean. That is the fully executed medical power of attorney. My father-in-law signed it in my presence 3 days ago. It gives me absolute legal authority to transfer the property deed to your syndicate right now." The lawyer did not blink. He reopened the folder, rotated it 180 degrees, and pushed it back toward Derek. He tapped his index finger firmly on the bottom of page 4. "Look at the paper," Derek the lawyer commanded quietly. Derek stepped forward, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He looked down at the premium legal document. He looked at the specific signature line located next to the yellow sticky tab. The line was entirely blank. There was absolutely no ink. The fading friction ink I had used in my dining room had completely vanished, leaving no trace behind. The document was nothing but a useless, void piece of paper. Derek stared at the blank line. His mouth fell open. He blinked rapidly, leaning closer to the paper as if the lighting in the room was playing a terrible trick on his eyes. He rubbed his thumb across the empty space, frantically searching for an indentation to prove that a signature had been there. but the paper was perfectly smooth. No, Derek stammered. His voice cracked, the arrogant confidence entirely draining from his body. No, that is impossible. I saw him sign it. I took a digital scan of it the very same day. You saw the scan. You verified the signature on the scan. A digital scan is not a physical legal document, the lawyer stated coldly, rising slowly from his chair. We paid you a $5 million advance based on the promise of a fully executed physical transfer. You have just handed a violent criminal syndicate a blank piece of paper on the exact night of our deadline. Valerie stepped forward, her face turning ashen. She looked over Derek's shoulder at the empty signature line. A desperate gasp escaped her throat. She began to hyperventilate, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. They had taken $5 million from a ruthless cartel, and they had absolutely nothing to give them in return. Martin slammed his glass of scotch down on the mantel. The crystal shattered against the stone, but no one flinched. Martin marched over to the table, his face pale with sudden terror. Derek, what did you do? Martin shouted, grabbing Derek by the shoulder. Where is the signed copy? You said the property was secured. You said the old man was incapacitated. I was! Derek yelled back, panic completely hijacking his voice. He signed it. I swear he signed it. I do not know what happened to the ink. The document has been sitting inside my secure safe for 3 days. The two men sitting beside the lead lawyer slowly pushed their chairs back. They stood up in perfect unison. They did not raise their voices. They did not shout. They simply unbuttoned their suit jackets, revealing the dark, heavy metal of firearms holstered at their waists. The gesture was a silent promise of impending violence. You tried to play a dangerous game with the wrong people, Derek, the lead lawyer said, his voice dropping into a lethal register. You took our money. You wasted our time. You failed to deliver the property. Our employers do not accept apologies, and they certainly do not accept blank pieces of paper. Please wait, Valerie begged, stepping in front of her husband, tears streaming down her face. Her voice was hysterical. There has to be a mistake. My father is completely confused. He is suffering from severe dementia. We can go to his house right now. We can force him to sign a new copy tonight. Please just give us 1 more hour. I promise you we will get the signature. The lawyer shook his head slowly. The deadline was midnight, Valerie. You failed. The penalty for stealing $5 million from this syndicate is not a renegotiation. The penalty is immediate collection of your assets, followed by the permanent cancellation of your debts. And we do not leave witnesses behind. The room plunged into absolute terror. Derek backed away from the table, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. Martin stood completely frozen, realizing his greedy brokerage deal was about to cost him his life. The two armed men took a deliberate step forward, their hands moving smoothly toward their holstered weapons. They were preparing to execute everyone in the room. The cartel men did not rush. They moved with the terrifying calm of professionals who had performed this exact task countless times. The lawyer simply ignored him, giving a subtle nod to his associates to proceed. But before the men could fully draw their weapons, a sharp buzzing sound pierced the heavy tension in the room. It was not a phone call. It was a harsh and repetitive vibration coming from the fireplace mantel. Martin's phone was lighting up. The bright screen illuminated the dark stone buzzing loudly against the wood. It was an urgent Google News alert. The sound was so unexpected and so completely out of place in the middle of a death sentence that the cartel lawyer briefly raised his hand, halting his men for a single second. The lawyer looked at Martin. Pick it up, the lawyer commanded quietly. Read it aloud. Martin picked up his vibrating phone with a visibly shaking hand. He stared at the glowing screen. The words did not make sense to him at first. He read the breaking news notification twice, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated shock. His voice was barely a fragile whisper when he finally spoke. Richard is on television right now, Martin said, his face completely devoid of all color. He is standing at a live press conference with the governor. The lead cartel lawyer frowned deeply. He aggressively snatched the phone directly from Martin and looked at the bright screen. The lawyer, dead eyes widened for a fraction of a second as he processed the breaking headline. "Turn on the television. Immediately," the lawyer ordered quietly, his tone brooking absolutely no argument. Valerie scrambled frantically to find the remote control on the marble coffee table. She pointed it at the massive flat-screen television mounted above the roaring fireplace. The festive, cheerful holiday music, playing softly in the background, cut off, abruptly replaced, immediately by the sharp, serious voices of local news anchors broadcasting live from downtown Chicago. The massive television screen flared to life, filling the lavish dining room with bright, undeniable truth. There I was, standing tall and resolute behind a polished wooden podium, adorned with the official seal of the city of Chicago. The bright, unforgiving stage lights illuminated every single deep line on my face, but I did not look anything like a frail, confused old man suffering from severe cognitive decline. I looked exactly like a man who had spent 4 difficult decades commanding absolute respect on massive commercial construction sites. I looked like a man who held the absolute overwhelming power of the federal government firmly in his right hand. The governor of Illinois stepped back respectfully, gesturing with an open palm for me to take the main microphone. The crowded room full of eager journalists fell completely breathlessly silent. I gripped the hard edges of the heavy wooden podium. I stared directly into the main broadcasting camera lens, knowing exactly who was watching me from the false temporary security of their lavish dining room. My voice echoed loudly through the microphone, clear, steady, and entirely unyielding. "Good evening." I began, my tone projecting absolute mental sharpness and unwavering commanding authority. "My name is Richard Sullivan. I have spent my entire life building the strong, enduring foundations of this great city. I have poured heavy concrete, erected massive steel frameworks, and worked tirelessly for 40 long years to create a highly secure future for my family. Decades ago, I purchased 50 acres of industrial land on the south side of Chicago. That sprawling property sat quietly for many long years, completely forgotten by most until very recently. I paused for a brief, calculated moment, letting the heavy weight of my deliberate words settle over the silent press room. I knew that across the freezing city, my treacherous daughter and her corrupt husband were watching their entire glamorous life crumble into absolute dust. Recently, I discovered that certain greedy municipal officials had secretly rezoned my private property to illegally facilitate a massive corporate buyout. I continued, my voice turning sharp and deadly deliberate. They arrogantly believed they could easily manipulate the legal system for their own personal gain. They foolishly believed they could manipulate me, assuming I was far too old and far too weak to notice their terrible crimes. But they severely underestimated the unbending resolve of a father protecting his hard-earned legacy. The flashing press cameras erupted brilliantly, capturing every single word. The serious federal directors standing behind me nodded in solemn, unified agreement. I took a very deep breath, preparing to finally deliver the ultimate, devastating blow to the terrible people who had actively tried to destroy my mind and steal my fundamental freedom. I do not care about corporate millions or corrupt technological buyouts, I stated firmly into the camera lens, projecting my voice across the entire nation. I care about true honor. I care about fundamental integrity. I care deeply about the brave men and women who fought and bled to defend this country. Therefore, as of this very precise moment, I am officially and irrevocably donating my entire 50-acre parcel to the United States Department of Veterans Affairs. The crowded press room erupted into a sudden chaotic frenzy of flashing lights and shocked murmurs. But I immediately raised my hand high, demanding absolute silence from the reporters. My piercing gaze remained locked intensely on the glowing camera lens. I delivered the final undeniable checkmate. This land can no longer be bought, sold, or secretly rezoned by corrupt city officials, I declared, my voice ringing with absolute crushing finality. It is now completely and forever untouchable by corporate greed or violent criminal influence. It now permanently belongs to the heroes of this nation, and it will be used to build the largest and most advanced veterans rehabilitation campus in the entire Midwest. The necessary federal transfer documents have been fully executed tonight, signed by me in perfect cognitive clarity and permanently sealed by the federal government of the United States. I stepped away from the wooden podium. The governor shook my hand warmly and enthusiastically. The federal directors applauded loudly, showing their deep respect. I had just completely vaporized a $120 million commercial real estate deal on live television, using absolutely nothing but my own sharp mind and the unmovable towering power of federal law. It was the ultimate undisputed victory for my family legacy over their pathetic, unbridled greed. Back in the lavish mansion, the resulting silence in the grand dining room was completely and utterly suffocating. The live television broadcast continued to play loudly in the background, showing important federal officials happily shaking my hand, but absolutely no one in the room was looking at the glowing screen anymore. The three heavily armed cartel lawyers slowly and deliberately turned their heads to look directly at Derek. The $5 million cash advance they had generously paid him was now utterly useless. The prime commercial real estate they desperately required to launder their vast illicit syndicate funds was now permanently locked away behind strict federal jurisdiction. They could not intimidate the United States government. They could not bribe or threaten the Department of Veterans Affairs. The land was forever beyond their violent reach. Valerie let out a quiet, terrified whimper, desperately, covering her pale mouth with her violently trembling hands. Derek stood completely frozen near the roaring fireplace, his arrogant, wealthy posture shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The empty green folder lay open on the mahogany dining table, like a forgotten, worthless tombstone. They had played a highly dangerous, arrogant game of deception and greed, foolishly believing they could easily sacrifice a vulnerable old man to quietly save themselves from their own disastrous financial mistakes. But they had just failed spectacularly. They were now completely surrounded by violent, unforgiving men holding massive, unpayable debts. Derek and Valerie were absolutely dead in the water. Their grand illusion of wealth, influence, and power had officially come to an abrupt, horrifying, and totally inescapable end tonight. I walked out of the bright lights of the City Hall press room and stepped into the freezing Chicago night. The heavy snow was falling, covering the empty streets. Warren walked beside me, his hands buried in his thick wool coat. We did not speak. We had executed the most dangerous legal maneuver of our lives with absolute precision. My driver was waiting at the curb. I climbed into the back seat and instructed him to take me home. I needed to be alone when the reality of my actions finally reached my daughter. I sat in the quiet darkness, staring at the muted television screen, knowing exactly what was happening inside her lavish dining room. I did not need to be physically present to understand the brutal mechanics of a collapsing criminal enterprise. Warren had explained the cartel operational protocols to me. They were violent men, but they were not stupid. Violence is a tool used to solve solvable problems, but a federal land transfer is an immovable brick wall. The moment I hung up the phone, the dangerous men standing in Valerie's dining room realized that executing Derek and Martin would not get their $5 million back. Shooting a corrupt municipal zoning commissioner inside a wealthy suburban neighborhood would only bring the police directly to their doorstep. They needed a smarter, highly calculated exit strategy. My phone vibrated again, breaking the silence of my living room. This time it was a secure call from Warren. He had spent the last 2 hours sitting in a discreet command center with his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, monitoring the fallout of our broadcast. I answered the phone, keeping my eyes fixed on the falling snow outside my window. "It is done," Richard Warren said, his low, gravelly voice humming with dark satisfaction. The trap did not just snap shut. It completely shattered their entire foundation. I just received word from my federal liaisons. The cartel lawyers in your daughter's house did not draw their weapons. They did not fire a single shot. They chose self-preservation. I listened intently, my grip tightening slightly on my crystal glass. Tell me exactly what happened, I requested quietly. The moment they realized the property was permanently locked under federal jurisdiction, the syndicate attorneys knew Derek was entirely useless to them, Warren explained. They also knew that a massive federal audit of Derek's municipal infrastructure accounts was inevitable now. The cartel does not go down for the pathetic financial mistakes of a greedy city official. So the lead lawyer pulled out his secure phone and made a direct call to the white-collar crime division of the FBI. I felt a cold wave of absolute finality wash over me. They surrendered him, I stated, the reality fully settling in. They completely burned him alive, Warren corrected smoothly. The cartel lawyers offered the federal agents a highly lucrative plea deal. They agreed to hand over every single piece of digital evidence proving Derek's $15 million embezzlement scheme. They provided the offshore account routing numbers, the dummy vendor receipts, and the digital scans of the fraudulent medical power of attorney Derek used to secure the $5 million bribe. They traded your son-in-law's entire life in exchange for total federal immunity regarding the real estate advance. The Bureau accepted the deal 3 minutes ago. I let out a long, heavy breath. The sheer efficiency of the criminal underworld was terrifying. Derek had arrogantly believed he could manipulate violent cartels and municipal budgets simultaneously. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. But in the end, he was nothing but a disposable pawn, easily discarded, the very second he lost his leverage. And Valerie had actively tied her entire existence to his sinking anchor. The federal agents were mobilizing before you even finished your press conference tonight. Warren continued, his voice carrying the momentum of absolute justice. The moment the cartel lawyers initiated that phone call and provided the verified digital evidence of municipal fraud, the federal judges signed the emergency arrest warrants. The charges are catastrophic, Richard. Grand larceny, severe municipal embezzlement, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, and attempted extortion. They are facing decades in federal prison. There will be absolutely no bail. There will be no corrupt city judges stepping in to quietly dismiss the charges. It is a completely airtight federal prosecution. I looked at the framed photograph of Valerie sitting on my mantelpiece. The smiling, innocent child in the picture was gone forever, replaced by a ruthless woman who had tried to steal my mind and my legacy. I felt a deep, profound ache in my soul, a quiet mourning for the family I had completely lost. But I also felt an unshakable sense of peace. I had protected my honor. I had protected my hard-earned legacy, and I had ensured that my life's work would ultimately serve the brave veterans of this country rather than lining the pockets of greedy criminals. Thank you, Warren, I said softly, for everything you have done for me. You are a good man, Richard, Warren replied respectfully. You did what you had to do to survive. Get some rest tonight. The storm is over. Warren ended the call, leaving me alone in the peaceful quiet of my living room. I set my phone down and leaned back in my leather chair. Across the city, far away from my quiet neighborhood, the flashing red and blue lights of federal law enforcement vehicles were tearing through the heavy winter snow. Dozens of heavily armed agents were rapidly converging on the lavish, brightly lit mansion. The screaming sirens pierced the freezing night air, echoing loudly against the sprawling suburban houses, growing closer and closer to Valerie's front door. The cartel lawyers were calmly walking out the back entrance, leaving my daughter and her arrogant husband trapped inside their crumbling illusion of wealth. There was absolutely no way out. There was no desperate lie left to tell. The sirens wailed louder, signaling the absolute and inescapable end. The heavy oak doors of the mansion blew open with a deafening crash. A dozen federal agents in dark tactical gear poured into the grand foyer, their heavy boots trampling the expensive imported rugs. They moved with terrifying precision sweeping through the decorated hallways and spreading across the lower level. Loud, commanding voices echoed over the soft holiday music playing from hidden speakers. They demanded everyone in the house immediately freeze and put their hands up. In the lavish dining room, the three cartel lawyers offered no resistance. They slowly raised their hands, stepping away from the mahogany table to allow the agents clear access to the actual targets. The lawyers had already secured their lucrative plea deal. They watched in cold satisfaction as the tactical team aggressively swarmed the room. Derek was the first to fall. Two massive federal agents grabbed him by the shoulders, violently spinning him around and slamming his chest hard against the polished dining table. The crystal champagne flutes shattered onto the floor, spilling golden liquid across the hardwood. Derek screamed in shock, frantically trying to explain. He was a high-ranking zoning commissioner, demanding to speak to his lawyers. The arresting agent ignored his protests. The agent loudly read off the catastrophic list of federal charges as he aggressively wrenched Derek's arms behind his back. Grand larceny, municipal bribery, massive wire fraud. The cold steel handcuffs clicked tightly around Derek's wrists, ending his corrupt career in city politics. The arrogant man who had tried to steal my life was now nothing more than a common federal prisoner. Martin tried to run. He stumbled backward away from the roaring fireplace, his eyes darting desperately toward the glass doors leading to the snowy patio. He did not make it more than 3 steps. A federal agent tackled him from the side, bringing the supposedly fragile man crashing down hard onto the stone hearth. Martin groaned in physical pain as the agent drove a heavy knee into his back, pinning him firmly to the floor. The agent informed Martin that he was under arrest for organized racketeering and facilitating illegal corporate bribes. Martin lay there on the cold stone, his face pressed against the ashes, completely stripped of his fake bravado. Valerie stood frozen in the center of the room. Her beautiful emerald green designer dress looked entirely out of place in the middle of the tactical raid. She watched in absolute horror as her husband and her stepfather were brutally subdued. When a female federal agent approached her with silver handcuffs, Valerie completely lost her mind. She began to sob hysterically, stepping backward and shaking her head wildly. She cried out that she was just a dedicated mother, that she had absolutely no idea what her husband was doing with the city funds, that she was completely innocent. The physical dismantling of her perfect, greedy little world was absolute and merciless. While Derek was being pinned to the mahogany table, dozens of tactical agents systematically tore through the lavish mansion, stripping away the glamorous facade to expose the rotting criminal core beneath. 2 agents carrying heavy breaching tools sprinted up the grand sweeping staircase, kicking open the double doors to Derek's private study. They completely ignored the expensive modern art on the walls, marching directly to the hidden steel wall safe. Within minutes, a specialized FBI forensic accountant bypassed the electronic keypad. They didn't just find the empty green folder, they found the motherlode. Stacked inside the steel vault were the encrypted offshore ledgers, the dummy vendor receipts from the municipal construction budgets, and the initial digital scans of the fraudulent medical power of attorney. The exact trail of digital breadcrumbs Warren had promised was neatly organized in a physical vault, proof federal prosecution. Downstairs in the grand foyer, the chaos reached a fever pitch. An agent in a dark windbreaker intercepted Valerie's designer handbag, which she had dropped near the coat closet in her panic. He dumped the contents onto the polished marble floor. Lipstick, expensive perfumes, keys, and an unlabeled orange plastic pill bottle clattered loudly against the stone. A senior tactical agent wearing heavy body armor knelt down and picked up the orange bottle. He unscrewed the white child-proof cap and poured a few of the generic heavy white sedatives into his gloved palm. He held the pills up to the harsh light of the tactical flashlights, his expression hardening into pure disgust. Valerie saw the pills in his hand. The last remaining ounce of blood drained completely from her face. Her knees buckled slightly as the absolute gravity of her actions finally caught up to her. We received a very interesting, highly detailed tip from a federal litigator regarding these specific pills. The senior agent announced, his voice cutting clearly through the chaotic noise of the raid. He looked directly at Valerie, who was violently shaking by the fireplace. Chemical analysis will confirm it by morning, but I guarantee these are prescription-grade heavy-duty psychiatric sedatives, the exact kind used to artificially induce symptoms of severe dementia. You didn't just forge legal documents, Mrs. Commissioner. You actively attempted to permanently poison and chemically restrain an elderly United States citizen to facilitate a massive corporate fraud. Valerie opened her mouth to speak, to lie, to invent another pathetic excuse, but absolutely no sound came out. The undeniable physical evidence was sitting right there in the federal agent's gloved hand. She could not blame Derek for this. She could not blame Martin. She was the one who had walked into my kitchen with a cheap cherry pie. She was the one who had poured those pills into my bottle with her own hands. The illusion of the innocent, dedicated mother was instantly and permanently vaporized. She was completely exposed as a cold-blooded, calculating predator, and now the absolute weight of the federal justice system was coming down on her to crush her. The female agent did not show a single ounce of pity. She grabbed Valerie by the arms, swiftly securing her wrists behind her back. The agent looked my daughter directly in the eyes and firmly stated her specific charges: conspiracy to commit elder abuse, medical fraud, attempted extortion. The agent revealed they had already secured the digital scans of the fraudulent medical power of attorney proving Valerie actively plotted to chemically restrain her own father. Valerie collapsed to her knees, weeping loudly, as the heavy reality of her impending federal prison sentence finally crushed her. Outside the mansion, the freezing winter snow continued to fall gently over the affluent suburban neighborhood. I sat quietly in the comfortable back seat of my hired car, parked just across the street from the chaotic scene. Through the tinted windows, I watched the bright red and blue emergency lights flashing against the surrounding houses. The neighbors had all come out onto their porches, wrapping their winter coats tightly around themselves, watching in stunned silence as the wealthy zoning commissioner had his entire life publicly dismantled. I rolled down my window just a few inches, letting the biting cold air wash over my face. I needed to witness the final consequence of their terrible greed. I needed to see it with my own eyes to truly close this painful chapter of my life forever. The heavy front doors of the mansion opened wide. A line of federal agents marched out into the freezing night, guiding their prisoners down the snow-covered steps. Derek walked with his head bowed deeply, trying desperately to hide his face from the watching neighbors. Martin limped behind him, looking like a broken and pathetic old man. Then came Valerie. She was shivering violently in the cold, her expensive green dress offering absolutely no protection from the harsh winter wind. Tears streamed heavily down her ruined makeup as she stumbled toward the waiting federal transport vehicles. As she reached the bottom of the icy driveway, Valerie suddenly lifted her head. Her frantic, searching eyes locked directly onto my dark car parked across the quiet street. Even through the falling snow, she recognized me sitting there. A sudden, desperate surge of energy coursed through her body. She pulled violently against the grip of the federal agent, holding her arms, stumbling awkwardly toward the curb where my car was idling. "Dad!" Valerie screamed. Her voice tore through the freezing night, echoing loudly over the idling engines of the police cruisers. "Dad, please. You have to help me. Tell them it is a terrible mistake. Tell them it is a huge misunderstanding. You know I love you. I am your daughter. Please save me." The federal agent easily pulled her back, holding her firmly in place on the snowy sidewalk just a few feet away from my open window. She looked at me with pleading eyes. She begged for the unconditional paternal rescue she had relied upon her entire life. She expected me to step out of the car, use my influence, and shield her from the devastating consequences of her evil actions. She expected the father she had tried to destroy to magically become her savior. I sat perfectly still in the comfortable back seat. I looked at the sobbing woman standing in the snow. I did not feel any anger. I did not feel any sadness. I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, peaceful emptiness. I leaned forward slightly, bringing my face closer to the open gap in the cold window. I looked directly into her desperate, tear-filled eyes. "You told me not to come for Christmas, Valerie," I said. My voice was incredibly calm, steady, and completely devoid of any emotion. "I am just respecting your boundaries." I pressed the button on the smooth wooden door panel. The dark-tinted window smoothly and quietly rolled up, completely cutting off the painful sound of her frantic, hysterical sobbing. I turned my head slowly forward, looking straight down the quiet, snow-covered street. I calmly instructed my private driver to take me safely home. As the heavy car smoothly pulled away from the curb, leaving my treacherous family behind in the flashing emergency lights, I finally felt the very heavy, suffocating weight lift from my shoulders. The long, bitter war was officially over, and I was now entirely free. 2 years passed since that freezing Christmas Eve. The brutal storm that had threatened to destroy my entire legacy was now nothing but a distant, quiet memory. I am 78 years old now. I stood comfortably in the warm morning sun, adjusting the collar of my tailored charcoal suit. Before me stretched the newly constructed Federal Veterans Housing Complex. It was a sprawling state-of-the-art rehabilitation campus, built precisely where my 50 acres of abandoned industrial dirt used to be. The grand opening ceremony was vibrant and deeply moving. There were no greedy corporate executives. There were no manipulative family members trying to steal my wealth. I was surrounded by real heroes, men and women who had sacrificed parts of themselves for this country, now walking through the doors of a sanctuary built specifically for them. The senior director of the Department of Veterans Affairs handed me the ceremonial golden scissors. I smiled warmly and cut the thick red ribbon, listening to the loud, genuine applause echoing across the massive courtyard. I had successfully transformed a barren wasteland into a beacon of absolute hope. The justice system had operated with the exact, ruthless efficiency Warren had promised. The cartel lawyers had delivered their undeniable digital evidence, and the federal courts showed absolutely no mercy. Derek was currently serving a 15-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The massive municipal embezzlement he orchestrated had completely ruined his life. Martin, the supposedly depressed stepfather, who had brokered the dirty real estate deal, received the exact same 15-year sentence for organized racketeering. Their grand illusion of wealth was entirely vaporized. Valerie did not escape the terrible consequences of her own actions. The federal prosecutors aggressively charged her with conspiracy to commit elder abuse and medical fraud. She was currently serving a 5-year sentence in a minimum security federal camp. She had lost her lavish mansion, her freedom, and her father, all for a frantic, greedy grab at a fortune she never truly deserved. As I walked through the beautiful landscaped gardens of the new campus, I reflected deeply on the painful journey that had brought me here. When Valerie banned me from Christmas dinner to plot my destruction, she thought she was permanently eliminating me from her life. She assumed that stealing my assets would leave me broken, lonely, and completely powerless. But she was entirely wrong. Cutting the cancer out of my life did not leave me lonely at all. It left me absolutely free. I did not lose my family that cold winter. I simply protected my own soul from people who wore the mask of family while holding a knife to my back. I found profound peace in knowing that my life's work was now securely protecting those who truly needed it, rather than financing the dark ambitions of a criminal syndicate. I had won the war, and I was finally living the rest of my days with complete and unshakable dignity. Family is not a free pass for exploitation. We are conditioned to believe that blood requires unconditional forgiveness, but true love cannot exist without fundamental respect. When the people you sacrificed everything for attempt to strip you of your dignity, your wealth, and your sanity. Setting a ruthless boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of self-preservation. You cannot heal a tumor with a bandage. You must surgically remove it. Never let age or isolation convince you that you are powerless. Your sharpest weapon is your mind and the ultimate revenge is a life well lived. If my brilliant counterstrike gave you the courage to stand up to toxic family members, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Have you ever had to cut off someone you loved to save yourself? Share your story in the comments below. See you in the next video.